Diablo 4. Activision Blizzard's next title in the Diablo franchise. Everyone that's a fan of the Diablo series and everyone that just loves ARPGs has been closely following the development of this game. And luckily for us, Blizzard has made this easier to do with regular quarterly updates, which is a brand new concept over there at Blizzard. It's pretty rare for them to seek outside validation and feedback, and it's even more rare for them to actually listen to that feedback. But to everyone's surprise, they seem to care about what we have been saying. They've made some adjustments to items and have updated the talent twig to a talent branch. And if we're lucky, we'll eventually get a real talent tree, but that's for an entirely separate video. What I want to talk about in this video is itemization, but more specifically the attack and defense modifiers on the items. This has been a hot topic since the reveal of Diablo 4's itemization, and since then, the developers have made quite a few changes to items, including the removal of the attack modifier that everyone hated so much. But the defense modifier has stuck around, and even though the attack modifier has been removed, I think there are some underlying issues with weapons that still need to be addressed. But first, let's talk about the dreaded defense modifier. The general consensus around the defense mod is that it lacks any sort of depth, but I think people fail to realize that something like defense in a Diablo game doesn't need layers of depth to make it a good system, and I'll explain why. Let's look at Path of Exile, which is the game that everyone is comparing Diablo 4 and literally every other ARPG on the market to. Path of Exile has evasion, resistances, block, spell block, energy shield, spell suppression, fortify, armor, endurance charges, and dodge. I'm probably missing some there, but that's the list we'll go with for now. Even though the game has so many different defensive options to build your character, it almost always feels terrible to build just one. Generally, your character will end up pulling from multiple sources of defense, and in a lot of cases will still feel very squishy. For example, recently it's been the meta to stack auras that increase your armor and evasion alongside capping your spell suppression. This isn't necessarily difficult to do, but it can be troublesome building into all that defense and still find the damage needed to play the game. And in a lot of cases, even with all of that extra defense, you'll find your character still to be pretty damn squishy given the investment. This leads to a handful of problems. First, it isn't rewarding to the player that feels like they are doing everything right, but still gets punished for following all the rules. Second, it reduces build viability. Most people want to play builds that can do most of the content without dying every 3 minutes, which means they will be playing with one of the 4 skills that offers that kind of stability. And lastly, it overcomplicates the game without any benefit for doing so. I say this because every character in the game can utilize every form of defense the game has to offer. This means that it's extremely difficult for the developers to properly balance any of them, which equates to players needing to invest into a plethora of defensive layers that thematically don't make any sense for their character. A great example of this is Fortify. Fortify was introduced into Path of Exile as a defensive tool that was supposed to be used by melee characters. The problem was that all you needed to do was hit an enemy to temporarily proc the Fortify effect. This meant that the majority of builds in the game were taking advantage of this defensive layer, which meant that it couldn't be as strong as it needed to be for melee characters. It also meant that all the other layers of defense needed to be balanced around the fact that every character in the game could use this effect. The developers have mostly fixed this issue with Fortify by giving players stacks of Fortify based off the amount of damage they deal with a hit. So you have to be hitting fairly hard to utilize it, but it still has its problems. Like some builds that primarily do damage over time, but deliver this damage via a weak melee hit have trouble getting to max stacks of Fortify. By now you're probably thinking, okay B-More, I get it, Path of Exile has a ton of different defensive options and they are very difficult to balance. But what does that have to do with Diablo 4? Well, I'm glad you asked. In Diablo 4 and most Diablo games in general, there are clear delineations between classes. This means that each class can have their own defensive abilities that can be balanced and iterated upon without affecting any of the other classes and their defensive capabilities. Because of this, developers have a ton of room to develop and home in on the skills and passives that affect a class's defense while allowing the defense stat to play a minor yet important role in the overall feel of a character's survivability. The problem with the defense stat arises when it becomes the primary indicator of how tough one's character is, which doesn't appear to be the case. We can already see with some of the items they have shared with us that there are going to be resistances. We just have to hope that they won't work like they did in Diablo 3, where you just essentially stack as much flat resistance as possible, which completely negates the whole balancing act of getting capped resistances on gear. We can also see that there will be dodge as well as block, life regeneration, percent damage reduction, life on hit, damage reduction while evading, and max life rolls on gear. And we can't forget that character stats will also play a role in one's tankiness. For instance, the intelligence stat on a barbarian increases all resistances. So you could find yourself in a scenario while playing a barbarian where having a piece of gear with some intelligence might be beneficial to rounding out your resistances. Keep in mind though that most of this stuff was revealed over 2 years ago, so it's all subject to change and there is most likely more layers of defense that we are not aware of yet. This is all a very long-winded way of saying that I think the defensive stat is perfectly fine. We don't need another Path of Exile, and we don't need complexity for the sake of complexity. As long as they give us other forms of defense, which they clearly have, then it will hopefully give us plenty of room to create our own unique builds. Okay, now I want to briefly talk about the changes they made with the attack modifier. As some of you may know, the attack modifier existed on weapons, rings, and amulets. They have completely done away with the attack modifier on amulets and rings, and weapons now have damage ranges on them with a damage per second listed as well as a secondary implicit that is unique to the weapon type. Rings and amulets, however, appear to roll the same type of secondary stats that can roll on weapons, effectively making them offensive item slots, which is definitely not a bad thing. But I think the developers missed the mark on weapons. With the changes made, weapons are essentially stat sticks. You find the weapon base you want for the implicit mod and just hope for the rolls on the secondary stats that are relevant to your build. I think what most players want with their weapons is a more traditional approach, one where the stats on the weapon affect the weapon itself, like a % increased damage mod that increases the damage of the weapon, or increased attack speed that increases the attacks per second with that weapon, or flat physical and elemental damage rolls. I could be wrong in thinking this, but I feel like a player's weapon should be one of the most important parts of a build, and giving players stats that can directly affect the strength of their weapons creates a more meaningful gearing experience. But that's just my 2 cents. How do you guys feel about the defense stat in Diablo 4, as well as the attack changes made to weapons? I genuinely want to hear your feedback on this. But thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next one.